by my side. Oh, I believe now, I love you till I die. You will sing me to sleep, you will hit me awake in a perfect life, a perfect life. And bullets in his hair. He has nothing to live for, nothing left to say. He's locking all the doors to keep the older wolves at bay. Spoons and foil are all he needs. A bed and some china, a lighter and some speed. It will sing you to sleep and it will hit you awake in a perfect life, a perfect life.
Director of the library, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all here tonight. I have to say, you exceeded our expectations. As you can see, we run out of chairs for the most part, although we do have a few up front if anyone wants to come from the back. So thank you all for coming tonight. This is really special for us to be part of this event tonight. It feels very core to us as the cultural center of the city of Portland, of the greater Portland region. Can you all hear me? Yeah. Okay. The library is a place of stories, and we care very deeply about stories. We care about capturing stories, whatever form they come in, whether it's books like Sandy Thippen's book, films like we just saw, whether it's news coverage or photographs or programs and events like this. We capture stories. We are proud to make them available to people that are curious, that want to learn, and then want to create their own stories. So it really is our pleasure to be hosting tonight's, I'm going to call it the symposium number 40, since we just saw the poster. So there are definitely some people that we want to thank. Primarily our partners and co-sponsors for this event are Maine Historical Society and the USM, I gotta get their name right, the USM Sampson Center for Diversity, and particularly I want to acknowledge Steve Bull, who put so much of this together. We also want to thank Pride Portland, who are putting together a terrific collection. This offering and others that are coming up, and we're pleased to be partnering with them in some other ways. And in particular, I also want to just take a moment to acknowledge some of my library colleagues here, particularly Jim Charette, Brandy Burrows, and Raminta Moore, and the wings over here. I'm going to name a few others. Elizabeth Hartzig, I think, is in the room. And Patty Deloise, Jerry Black, Kim Simmons, Tom Moody. This was a group that came together because they felt it was very important for the library to do events related to Pride Month, and so we're thrilled that we are able to host tonight's event and to do some other things like tomorrow night at 7:30 we are showing the film Brother Outside, The Life of Bayard Rustin here in the Rhines Auditorium. Its admission is free, so we hope that anyone interested will come to that. And on Saturday in the Pride Parade, our bookmobile, our flashy colorful bookmobile. Check out the materials. We've got some LGBT materials that will be on the bookmobile as well as others. We have a film festival that's running that day too. I understand it's going to be a gorgeous day, but I mean, we can have too much sunshine, right? So if you want to come inside, we have 3 films that we're showing through the day. Because of copyright, I cannot name the titles, but you can talk to any of the staff people that are here tonight to find out what films we're showing. They're all fabulous films. And we are the keepers of copyright. We take it very seriously. We also want to draw your attention to some special offerings that we have on our website. The team has put together a number of book lists of recommended reading for all ages, particularly related to LGBT themes, book lists and film lists. And you probably, if you had a chance to walk around in the corridor area, you would have seen some of the photographs that were blown up. Those are from our Portland Press Herald still film negative collection. So those are photos from the Portland Press Herald. We've developed a fabulous partnership to make those available. So sometimes they're in the newspaper itself, and then sometimes we make it part of exhibits. So we have been finding great photos of the movement over the years, and in fact, I think we uncovered photos from the original Pride Parade in 1987 that are there. So please take a look there, and you can see more if you look on our website. And we also recently launched full-text digitized Casco Bay Weekly, which many of you may be familiar with. It was a very popular alternative newspaper here in Portland, a weekly newspaper published from 1988 to 2004, and we've just been able to digitize it completely. So that's now available on our website too. And it has some terrific coverage of the movement as well. So please avail yourself of some of these resources, and thank you everybody that had a role to play in pulling this together, and all of you for coming. So it's now my distinct pleasure to introduce the moderator of the panel, Susan Mariah Breeding. While they're setting up, I'm just going to name a couple of other names that I neglected to name before. Carla J. Susan Mariah Breeding is our moderator tonight. She was the co-founder of the Maine Gay Task Force and Maine Lesbian Feminist. She was active in the Maine movement for LGBT and other civil rights from 1972 to 1977 until she went west to California to the People's Law School. Has now lived there for 40 years, steering her interests into counseling and advocacy, much of the time with people with chronic addiction problems in long-term residential treatment. She's an MSW and PhD, currently a counselor and consultant in private practice, working from a perspective that attributes much of what is labeled mental illness to the impact of oppression and the trauma of injustice. We welcome Mariah and her family and her loved ones here tonight, and I will now turn this over to her.
Hi, everybody. This actually is our family and our loved ones. I also want to acknowledge that our event is being filmed tonight. It's being taped by the Community Television Network and will be available to watch on Time Warner Cable Channel number 5 in the greater Portland area and on demand on their website, ctn5.org. Thank you very much to CTN for your wonderful work in this and other places. It's a little humbling to look at pictures of yourself 45 years ago and then get here, so I'm still kind of reacting to Stanley and Andy's pictures. They say maybe more in those pictures than any of us will say here tonight. But I'm going to say just briefly that this panel represents, I'd say, the first decade of what we call organized out, publicly out, gay rights struggle in Maine. And I'm saying that because we talk about it beginning in 1972, but I know that there were people out there before 1972 who were doing this work. Maybe they were doing one at a time, or maybe they were doing it in their churches, or maybe they were doing it privately. These are the first people I know who are doing it publicly in an organized group, but we stand on the shoulders of people who were doing it privately in the decades before that. I think I'm just going to say something basic kind of about the way the movement unfolded in Maine. It kind of had three components, and they fell sort of neatly into geographical regions. The southern part of the Maine movement in 72 and 73, which is the part that I'm most familiar with, was really grassroots. We were working people. I don't think any of us were in college, who sort of came together in circles of friendship and lovership and fomented for change. And that part, that grassroots organization, is an essential component of raising culture, of changing people's minds, of just being able to walk down the street and say, I'm gay, was in those days revolutionary. So that's one component of what happened in Maine. The second component was in central Maine was the emergence of the student movement, which is happening almost at the same time. That's those brave students. Steve Bull, I think, is going to speak particularly to that era. who organized the first public, huge gatherings. Students who were brave enough to fight at their university to bring us all together. The third part of the movement, and others will be, Lois Reckett particularly will be speaking to that, is about the coalescing into a formal political movement for legal rights. These are the folks who started campaigning to have the laws changed so that homosexuality was no longer a crime. Moving on to marriage, moving on to custody, moving on to actual legal civil rights. And I think any change movement that's going to be successful is going to have all of these components. So on this lineup of us, we'll all be speaking to different parts of that. As I said, the part that I wanted to speak to is the kind of social, cultural grassroots movement. And I think I just want to say a moment or two about my own background, which is that it wasn't gay rights that first moved me. When I was 12, I remember I would have been 12 in 1952, shortly after World War II, and I stayed up nights unable to sleep thinking about the Holocaust, seeing images of the Holocaust, being horrified that such a thing as genocide could exist. And I went to the Unitarian Universalist Church as a young person, where, since we were not talking about God in the Unitarian Universalist Church for the most part, since the vote was out on whether or not they existed in any form or not, what we were talking about was what was going on in Selma. And my minister was not standing up there talking about sort of our Christian duty. That's fine for people whose were, but our minister was talking about, can you get down there? Can you support equal rights for people of color? Can you give me money so I can go if you can't go? And the third influence for me, the third kind of rights movement that I was interested in was class depression. And that was really just what it meant to be in public school in the 1960s, watching people academically tracked in the class by their socioeconomic backgrounds. It wasn't that the bright kids were in the college classes, it's that the wealthy kids were in the college classes. So that's kind of what my background was. We'll try many microphones. All the microphones, I want all the microphones. They're mine, they're mine. So there I was, 20, in a headband, braces on my teeth, wearing knee socks, I think, and I fell in love with a woman. It was that simple. Actually, I fell in love with this woman, Wendy. And although I didn't know it at the time, I fell in love with this woman's family, and her sister, and her children, who are, I'm lucky enough to say, are present tonight. So we fell in love, and as who is the current person who says that I kissed a girl and I liked it, Katy Perry, right? Well, I more than liked it, I loved it. She's ambivalent, and I wasn't. And that was very helpful. If you talk about the political being personal, the power of that kiss was so extraordinary. It felt so good. I knew it couldn't possibly be wrong. So when I think what gave me the strength to be out, I think of my background, I think of my nearly libertarian parents, I think of the fact that I had people to be out with. But I also think that I couldn't deny the hedonistic spirituality of my connection with another human being. It couldn't feel right to me that love could be wrong. So, that was my background. The only thing I want to add about that is there was a very special poignancy to that, because I think many of us will speak to some part of what the times were actually like back in 1972, but I can say that I had never knowingly met a lesbian or gay man, I had never seen an image of women kissing. I had never seen an image of men kissing. I don't know that I had seen an image of queer people at all, whatsoever. So when I think of the distance from then till now, where we have Michael Sam kissing his white boyfriend, an African-American pro football player, kissing his white boyfriend on national television while 6 newscasters watch in solemnity. This is a difference. This is a huge difference. And so in that absence of knowing what it could look like to be gay, we had to invent it. And that's both scary and it's both wonderful. So I have 3 brief anecdotes, maybe I'll have time for one, that I want to talk about that illustrate for me what was really important about the movement. The first was how we fought for ourselves. I remember going to New York City on the 3rd March following the Stonewall riots in 1972 with Wendy and Stanley. We drove down in some car that could barely make it and walked in the Gay Pride March, the 3rd one held in New York City. There were hundreds of people in the street. We were carrying an umbrella with a sign that we had paper clipped, I think, that said Maine on it, on the back of some envelope. And for the hundreds of people in the street, being filmed by the FBI, I will point out, and threatened at various street corners, what I remember is the thousands of gay people hanging out of the apartment windows, hanging from the stories, screaming and cheering and yelling. And the cry then was, as I think it still is today about different things, join us, join us, join us. That's what the hundreds of us in the street were yelling to the thousands of people who were still watching. It's a very different kind of gay pride experience. The second thing I remember is the way we worked coalitionally with other people. That, I think, for me, was exemplified by the Stowe House picket. The man who owned the Stowe House, which is an inn restaurant in Brunswick, where Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, a kind of fundamental place of civil rights. The owner fired all of the career waitresses, mostly women supporting their own families, working class women, and hired pretty college boys to take their place. And we, among many other, I remember Stanley Fortuna running in the door. And this is about waitresses being fired, right? This is not about gay rights. This is about waitresses being fired. Stanley Fortuna came running in the door, waving a pamphlet, and said, "Oh my God, we have to do something about this." And we did. We went and marched with United Low Income. We went and marched with the waitresses themselves, who at first were ashamed to join us because of who we were. But I think when they saw who we were and that we were willing to stand on the line for them, they began to be willing to stand on the line for themselves. I remember one of them saying, you guys have opened my mind. I have different dreams now than I did before this. Maybe I am worth something after all. And I remember those 9 protesting groups and the waitresses and the owner of the inn sat down together and signed an agreement that they got their jobs back and they got pay for all those weeks of strikes. And my last memory is of Peter Preiser, sitting here to my right, in his gorgeous shirt. He always was well dressed. Walking into McDonald's, which had maybe been in existence 2 years at the time, I don't know, and standing in front of the counter with his hand out saying, "Don't wrap my hamburger up in that disposable stuff that's killing trees." You know, back in those days, hamburgers looked like they were the crown jewels. They were packaged in McDonald's in tons of paper. He said, "I want it right here on my hand. I want the naked hamburger on my hand. I don't want anything on it. I don't want trees killed for my hamburger." And I remember looking at Peter thinking, nobody in this restaurant is going to be the same after watching this. Of course, now we might not be in McDonald's. The point is, here was somebody who took it to the level of love for the world. And that's, I guess, the thing that I want to say about this for me. We're looking back at the past, but I also want to look ahead to the future. I never thought, my 22-year-old self, that what would be about. The civil rights of gay people would twist and turn on marriage. You know, back in the day, marriage was something that we were actually trying to change and challenge. You know, we didn't want to join the military, we wanted there to be no armies. Say is, it's love, and I hope those conservatives in California opposing the right of gay people to love and marry one another used to hold up signs making fun of us, saying, what will be next? You want to marry a tree? What will be next? You want to marry a dog? And I say yes. I would like it if we could feel as passionately and as lovingly about every other creature on this earth as we do about the people we choose to marry. That's the revolution I want to still be part of. So here's a woman I still love after all these years. It's not often you can say that about your first lover. I feel really honored to introduce Wendy Ashley, who's an extraordinarily cultural anthropologist, astrologer, author, lover, mother, citizen of the earth.
Yeah, I was going to start. I'm Wendy Ashley. I was going to start by saying I left my husband for a 19-year-old schoolgirl with braces, headbands, knee socks, pleated skirt. She was very middle class, and we had a wonderful, crazy time. There was a poor young woman living with me who had lost her mind and didn't find it in the back seat of the car, but we took her everywhere, and she had a lot to say about us. It wasn't all that, no. But anyway, we did have a wonderful time, and we moved to Portland, Maine from Gunquit, where I lived. And imagine that, I had to move out of a Gunquit because of the scandal. And we moved to Portland, Maine, and Mariah went to work at the mall at the bookstore. And across from the bookstore was a clothing store, and Stanley worked at the clothing store. There's Stanley right there. Hi, Stan. And somehow he did move in with us for a little while, didn't he?
Yeah.
We had the most fantastic water fights. We start with squirt guns and ended up with buckets. And would go around and around the house. The FBI did come to visit us and was concerned about everyone we knew. And that was kind of awful, strange, creepy. But anyway, there we were as a triad of some sort. And then Stephen turned up next. And we moved to Brunswick, Maine. And this is really, in a sense, like the kernel for the Portland, Maine area, a kind of kernel. I did work at the Y, Lois worked there. I thought she was suspiciously like us. She was quite wonderful. We really met a lot of people in a lot of active movements. Native American people, people upstairs who were managing to get black people into Canada for some reason. I don't know what they were doing. We had a lot of extraordinary contact with people up and down the state. And the most important thing to me initially was that I not lose my children to my husband, because being a lesbian was not a reason to keep your children. So I remember the lawyer saying to me, Mrs. Ashley, do you know a woman named Mariah Breeding? And I said, yes, I do. And he said, who would you say she is to you? And I said, I would say she's my best friend. And he said, wouldn't you say she was more than that? And I said, no, I wouldn't say that. And then for some reason I became famous as someone who kept her children in spite of being a lesbian. And my children, thank you. And two of my children are here today. I'd love them to stand up. They attended many symposiums, and they also gave workshops on being the children of gay or lesbian parents. Do you remember that? Very well. And Edmund has a song that he sings to me that I would like to ask him to sing, but I don't think he will. It's really funny. What do you think, Edmund?
Sure. But I'll need one of these microphones. This really isn't my song. I borrowed it from a good friend of mine from college, who had it from a friend of his, who apparently was in the same situation that I was as a child. And it goes like this. My mother's lover is my mother too, and my other mother's lover is my mother too. And if my mother had another lover, I would call that lover mother, as my mother's lover is my mother too.
And after dinner, Mariah played softball with the kids. Anyway, I mostly wanted to say that it was so important to have a community. We started one right in our own house, and it got bigger and bigger and went all the way down the coast and both directions. But it was wonderful, as I'm sure most of you know, to have a gay, lesbian, transsexual, transgender, singing children, symposium leaders. We were all wonderfully supportive of each other in many other movements as well, including the Stowe House waitresses. We're very happy to do that. Thank you.
Our next speaker is going to be Stephen Bull, who you have seen many pictures of throughout the night. One of the prime movers and leaders of the student movement and the starter of the symposiums in great opposition at the time.
This is the one good one.
This is our workable microphone.
I don't know how I'm going to follow the song and dance, but that's good. As you can get a sense from the wonderful montage that Andy and Stan did, it really was a different political period. and that we grew up in, where there was massive social struggles going on. Most of us are deeply affected, like Mariah said, by the civil rights movement in the South. There was a women's movement. There was a war raging in Vietnam. I went to a demonstration at Boston Common. They had like 100,000 people at it. So the Stonewall Rebellion, when it happened in June of '69, it was in that context, and it basically injected some new blood and militancy in what was then called gay liberation. And there were student groups like ours forming all around the country, and oftentimes universities were, they were denying them the right to organize. I went to my first meeting in September of 1973 of Gay Support in Action, and it was a fairly new organization itself. And there I met Sturgis Haskins, who was chairing the meeting, Karen Bai, and John Frank. I would recommend you pick up the book on Sturgis by Sandy, that Sandy Fippen put together. He's out there signing copies. Sturgis chaired that meeting, and the following week we met at campus in Orono and started what was going to become the Wilde-Stein Club. Sturgis and Karen both passed away the last couple of years, and I'd like to honor their memories here tonight. We started meeting in what was called the Co-Lounge in Memorial Union, and it had like 2 sets of glass doors, and it was the hallway was going to the cafeteria. And we noticed that it was basically the first step in coming out, because it was like a widely spaced picket line, you know, in that corridor, people going to the cafeteria supposedly, and then coming back and looking in, and then going back the other way. Eventually a lot of those people were on the other side of the doors, but it was really, it was like the beginning of coming out. In October we got provisional status as a student group. And in November, I came out to my parents because I was going to be on TV as being the public spokesperson for Wilde-Stein. During this period, the university had an ill-timed fundraising campaign to raise some capital funds. And what happened was all these ministers started to organize. You probably saw it in some of the displays. December, we decided we were going to have a dance. And we announced it, and for some reason, Associated Press picked it up and it became a national story. I think it was just the oddity that, you know, they thought gay liberation was an urban phenomenon, and what are these people doing in Orono, Maine? It just didn't make any sense. So it became a story and was a national story on and off for the next few months. The preachers, mobilized their congregations against us. The state legislature threatened to withhold $1 million in funding to the university, which doesn't seem like much now, but was a lot of money then. We then, in January, announced our intention of having the first symposium. There's a funny story on that. We started to call it a conference, but then the ministers started to call it a conclave of queers. So we decided to make it highly, symposium. What could they do to that? And the Board of Trustees for the university system met in January, and the week before, the UNH students had won a battle in federal court to be recognized. So really, we painted the administration into a corner, and they passed a motion, which is also in the displays, that enabled us to have the symposium, which was wildly successful, over 300 people at it. It was really a who's who of gay liberation leadership in the East Coast at the time. But I also want to talk about, for everyone who went to that symposium, there are many who did not. It was a very fearful atmosphere. The publicity was really ramped up. But we got letters from people. I remember a hairdresser from Skowhegan sending in like $7 of tips from that day's tips towards the symposium. We got a tax return of $125 from a guy in Augusta. So for everyone that was there were probably 10 or 12 people that were too fearful to come. But most importantly were the people that are here at this table tonight that came to the first symposium. And from that, we started a statewide organization called the Maine Gay Task Force. The very next month, we went to the Democratic Party convention in Maine and got a gay rights plank passed. We showered the convention with confetti from the balconies. We were a festive group. And it was only the second one in the country. The next year, we got homosexual acts deleted from the Maine Criminal Code, which dated from 1840. I think it was time. It was also a service for many heterosexual couples, I understand, as well. You know those 3 acts I'm talking about. In August, we published our first Maine Gay Task Force newsletter, and then we got an office the next year here. And I wanted to kind of end with an observation that from the bully pulpits, the fundamentalists gloomily predicted the end of civilization as we know it, the decay of all morals. If we held a symposium in Maine, that it would then become a mecca for homosexuals over and over and over again. The odd thing is I have been spending some time in Portland recently. Particularly this week. And if we on this panel have contributed in any way to the prediction of the fundamentalist preachers, you're welcome.
Hello, is this you working? Yes. I'm the only person at the table that didn't write something. It's probably going to show in what I'm going to say. I moved here in 1969. I grew up in a small town in New Hampshire, Rochester, New Hampshire. And I had tremendous low self-esteem. Incredibly shy. Would walk down the opposite side of the street if there were people, coming up that I just really would avoid. During my sophomore and senior year, I toyed with the thought of killing myself because I knew that I was different, that I was attracted to men. And I finally, I got out of high school, I moved to this big city, Portland. It was, Portland, when I got here, if you grow up in a small town, it was really a big city. It's not like, what it is today, the downtown. It was a really thriving city. There was Porches, Mitchell and Bronze, there was Rhines. I mean, it was a bustling city. And, I moved here with a guy that was older than me, and I stayed in a relationship for 3 years that was really unhealthy. Again, I had really low self-esteem. And I was able to end that relationship because of the 2 women that were at the end of the table. And that's when I ended the relationship, and I ended up living with them. And through them, I began to learn self-respect. And I became very angry. So, I was really very angry, and I became very strident. And I kept thinking, how can people treat people who are supposedly mentally ill so badly? Where do you get off on treating people like that? So I must say that for my involvement in the movement as it went along, that is really what fueled me, was my anger. And I ended up getting involved in a relationship with Stephen Leo. We were together, I think, almost 3 years. And in that time, in our relationship with these 2 women, we then ended up meeting Peter Preiser when we spoke it was a Q&A talk in Brunswick. And it like sort of formed. It started out very slowly. Went to the Pride March in New York, and it just sort of went on. And you know, back then there were no cell phones, so you could actually call directory assistants. And if you saw something or read something that you didn't like, and if you got the person's name and knew what town they lived in, you could get their phone number. So, I mean, we found, Stephen brought some stuff to the house today that was a letter from a guy that wrote this book about how you should never get involved with a gay person in business, especially a gay man, because all they were there trying to do would be to seduce you. So, I mean, this is great to have seen this today, because the guy wrote the letter back and believed that he was not wrong, because what I did was I called the town I lived in Connecticut with the name, and I got his phone number and talked with him for almost an hour on the phone about what he had written in his book. And then he wrote a letter to us that will go to the archives as well. But in my role as far as being involved with Maine Gay Task Force, when we started the publication of the newsletter, it was like that's all we did, you know, was be part of this, you know, manufacturing this and getting the word out there, because my biggest concern always would be that there would be other young males, females, whoever, that would feel the way that I did with low self-esteem, and that they would actually take their life. That's what the motivating force was for me in what I did during that time. And I'm very proud of it. I don't have any more low self-esteem. That ended a long time ago.
Is this working? Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is Peter Preiser, and I was a part of the group represented tonight here on the panel back in the early 70s. I grew up in a pretty normal, pretty dysfunctional, no, it was actually averagely dysfunctional home outside of Philly. Had an average teenage life, but I knew by about 12 or 13 that I liked other boys. That I kept to myself back in the 60s. I went to Penn State when I was 18, again, pretty average kid, and I was attracted to a lot of the protests. I guess there was, like Stan, I had issues, you know, and I had also very low self-esteem. But I was attracted to what I saw, and there were protests by African American students. There were anti-war protests, of course. There's even a protest that I joined where we got into trees because they wanted to cut them down in State College, PA. And so there I was at 18, 19, kind of getting my feet wet a little bit with activism. But there was always a part of me, I knew, I think the word gay might have been used back in the late 60s, I'm not sure, but I knew I was gay, but I wasn't doing what I really wanted to do. Now we can fast forward. I moved to Portland when I was 22, and I think it was 1973, I saw an article in the paper saying that there would be a panel discussion at Bowdoin College by, I think it might have been a group called Lambda, but the point was, it was lesbians and gay guys who were going, the gay men doing this group. And I thought, well, I'm going to drive up and check it out. And I did, sat in the audience, and the audience at Bowdoin College was a little hostile that night, I have to say. And Mariah was there, Stan, Stephen, others that I don't remember. I sat there and got really pissed off. And finally, I just said, I can't do this. I got up, and I joined the panel right on the stage. I had no idea. And I was actually more prepared then than I am now. Anyway, it was nice to finally come home and work for something that was very dear to my heart. Okay, one other thing I want to talk about, time passed, calendars falling down, and I ended up being co-editor of Mainly Gay. And I'm doing this as sort of a slight digression. I think it's very important here tonight to say this. The publication, as far as I was aware, reached a lot of people in Maine, and before cell phones, before anything. It was going to the post office and buying a stamp, or getting on the phone if you wanted to communicate. So the publication was very important to the movement and to us. And the only way we could afford to do this, because none of us had any money, was we had to sell advertising. And so we go around, this is 1974 or 5, Casco Bank, no, they're not advertising with us. But, the gay bars were advertising with us. And it was these bars that gave us the money to keep the publication going. And with that in mind, and I know there's someone in the audience here, there's a gentleman named Roland Labby, who opened, it'll come in a second, who opened the first gay bar in Maine a year before Stonewall in 1968. And it was his money, because he was a great advertiser, that kept the whole show going. And so, Roland, if you're here, could you stand up just for a second? Thank you very much.
Talked into one of these in a while. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
All right, good. My name is Stephen Leo, and I guess what I'm going to be concentrating on tonight is the founding of the Gay People's Alliance at the university. Well, we called it UMPG POGO at that time. But first, I wanted to give you a little bit of background. I'm kind of unusual because I was actually born and raised in Portland, and from a Catholic family of 8, working class background. And in 1960, at 11 years old, I, like most Catholics, I was excited by John F. Kennedy's run for the presidency. And he came to Portland that year to campaign, and with a lot of other little kids my age, I was 11. We made signs, and we got on a bus and were transported to the airport to meet him. And we're all kind of in a line, and I shook his hand, and then I got in line again, I shook it again, and one more time, and he was firing me. I don't think he noticed the little hand. So I was pretty smitten, and I think that's why I was here. That's when I became a political junkie, so to speak, and liberal to lefty Democrat for lifelong, and so in 1967 I enrolled at UMPG, and to study history of government, and became very active in the Young Democrats Club. And, for complicated reasons, I withdrew in a couple of years, and I kept being active in the Young Democrats, and I eventually became president. So that entitled me to be on the state committee and to go to the 1972 convention in Miami Beach, and as a supporter of Edmund Muskie. We were all supporting Muskie. Of course, Muskie lost and McGovern won, and I supported McGovern, and McGovern lost big time. But probably for me, the most mesmerizing thing at the convention was the fight over the gay rights plank. It might have been the first time at a National Party convention. And but in the gallery there were a large contingent of gay activists, and they were pretty noisy. And we were just, it was mesmerized. We were all just looking at them, and they were carrying on, and I kept thinking I belong up there. I wasn't really out yet, but I was working at Walden Books, and I had met Susan Mariah, and she introduced me. We eventually came out to each other in, this was 1972 again, and she introduced me to her darling little Wendy, and then to this fellow here, very dynamic and a little volatile. We just got going, and with a whole bunch of other people. We met Peter, and we formed groups and did all these things, some of which you heard about. One of the groups was Lambda. Some of us living in Brunswick, and we held some dances in the Unitarian Church there. And then it was in our apartment that we met, and we started the Maine Gay Task Force in Brunswick. That's where I met Steve and John Frank and a number of other people, Karen Lai. And so then I decided to go back and finish my degree at the university. And but I had the notion of maybe starting a gay group there, the first one on campus, if you don't count the resident fraternity, which maybe you probably should count. None of you are here, but anyway. So our first meeting was in October 2nd, 1975, and not too many people turned out, but it was something. It was a start, and then over the next few weeks, I met some wonderful people, some of whom are here tonight, and some of them aren't. But among them was late Tony Norton, who was really very, very valuable and helpful in keeping the group going. And I hasten to add that Stan was at the university at the same time, and he did kind of a lot of the background work. We're co-founders of the group, and attended some of the first meetings. And I was elected first president. I don't know if I elected myself, but I was first president. And then we had a faculty advisor named Dr. Wilde-Stein, who's now deceased. And but probably for me the greatest boon was meeting this very handsome young man named William McMenamin in one of our first meetings in 1975. And October 1975, his 21st birthday, and by February we were living together. And we still are. We were married in Massachusetts where we lived about 7 years ago. And he's been my soulmate, love of my life for all these years. So I lucked out with that. Anyway, it was quite a battle at the Student Senate just to get funding. They always wanted a membership list, and I would never provide one. Because it's a secret. I mean, you know, these people in the club, I can't tell you who they are. Half of them were not even connected to the university. we were kind of a resource. We got a little office in the back of the Student Union. That's where we were, 92 Bedford Street. And we had a nice little office, and we were a resource for the greater gay community. And, eventually, I got elected to the Student Senate, and still I had to fight the Student Senate then was controlled by Sigma Nu, I think it was, fraternity, pretty much, on campus, and there's two sets of brothers, and they ran everything, and but we still managed to squeeze some funding out of them. It was every year it was a battle. But, in addition to that, we held some really nice dances in the cafeteria for people who didn't want to come in the bar scene. Nothing wrong with the bar scene, but it was a nice luncheon. And we held peer counseling, did various workshops, and had a lot of political infighting, and then probably our largest endeavor was Symposium 3, which I feel like I worked on for months. But it turned out really exciting and very successful. 3 days, and so you saw some of the images from. We held 17 workshops, and 2 were for men only, 5 were for women only, and. Then, the last thing I wanted to talk about was, which you're going to hear more of in a minute, Lois, is some of us worked on the first gay rights bill, helping to set that up, and one of the things that I did was lobbying up at the State House, and I remember lobbying a state senator named Olympia Snow. She was very nice, and really nice, and I thought, maybe she'll vote for it. But I guess that was just her modus operandi. She didn't vote for it. But I did manage to get a young, very young Republican who was from a rural town and state legislature. And I think he was a deputy sheriff too. And we spent a good bit of time in his car talking. And he did vote for it. But he lost his seat. So with that, I think now I'm going to turn it over to Lois.
When Steve first started talking to us about this panel, we were calling it, at least amongst ourselves, our song to ourselves, because we didn't know that you all would come and listen. But I want to tell you, as part of that, how I came to this place and in the 70s, and how I ended up intertwined with these good people on the panel today. because my route is a little different than most of the people that you've heard already. In 1971, I found the women's movement in the person of the National Organization for Women. Ironically, I found it at the YWCA and also at the University of Maine at Portland-Gorham. And my life has never been the same, as working for women's rights brought purpose and new meaning to my life. And in the course of that journey, for the first time, I knowingly met lesbians as we worked side by side for equality under the law and for reproductive rights. I was, I thought, an enlightened heterosexual married woman. And married indeed I was. And for the first of 2 times to men. My friends eventually came to call me a slow learner. I suspect Wendy is in that group, and I wish she'd told me earlier that the truth. But along the way, and I would add that I'm now currently married, but to a woman, thanks to the state of Maine. And she too is here over in the corner. But along the way, as a result of feminist activism and new friendships that I had formed, I began increasingly to speak up on behalf of my sisters, whose sexuality I believed was different from mine, and who were under attack legally, emotionally, and in some arenas politically. I began and I rose through the ranks of NOW, first in Portland and then statewide. And unfortunately, I yielded to pressure to run for president of Greater Portland NOW, because we feared that the community was not ready for the open lesbian who was truly the next in line, Marilyn Richards, who even at the time was supportive of my doing it, but I always felt terrible about it on some level. Again, I wasn't out at that point. I was still, I think I still thought I was straight at that point. In 1973, I was chosen to lead Maine Now statewide, and I did so for 3 years. And at the state conference, after which I was scheduled to leave office in Maine, in the living room of my best friend Lucy Harrington in Edgecombe, Maine, Maine Now decided to introduce the first bill providing protections for gay men and lesbians in Maine. Our attitude as a women's group was, if not now, when, and if not us, who? Because we too had been active in the gay rights plank in the political system in the Democratic Party, because as everyone always accused us, we were indeed an arm of the Democratic Party at that point. We did work in the legislature, and so we felt that we had the best chance of having something happen. So, however, we were not totally delusional. And we proceeded to look for allies in the struggle and found them in the Maine Gay Task Force and later in Maine Lesbian Feminists, although Maine Lesbian Feminists was a predominantly social group, at least at the time. The rest of the tale of that campaign I will excerpt, I can't even say the word. I will take the facts from what Stephen Bull kindly refers to as my eventually best-selling memoir, which is at this moment about 80% done and predominantly unedited. So let me share with you the highlights of it. Of course, the highlight for me was that in the midst of the campaign, I fell in love with a woman from away, and all of a sudden the world made sense, except for the part that I was still married to a man, and was the straight spokesperson for the campaign that had just been launched. So it brings up a tale I'll tell a little bit later here that, about the campaign, but that Peter plays a major role in because he was the gay spokesperson for the campaign, and so we had this dual role that became a little odd. So in 1976, a small group of us that I've just talked about began meeting to strategize for the campaign in Maine and to become, we hope, the first state to pass civil rights legislation for gays and lesbians. So we formed the Maine Coalition for Human Rights. It just sounded bigger and more important than what otherwise might be the case, because there weren't very many of us. Although periodically, during, as I said, we were not really delusional, although periodically in the 8-month campaign, we thought we might win. And the person who thought we might win was the man who I had hoped was going to be here tonight, but I don't think he is the man who was the prime sponsor of that bill, and who's still living in Portland. And I'm happy to say was at my wedding last year. But we asked Jerry Talbot to be the sponsor of that bill. It was sort of a reality check, because we looked for sponsors, and we thought we should have a statewide presence, and we would do all these things. Well, we found 2 sponsors. Jerry was the first, and the other was Larry Connolly, whose son you may have known about because he worked on the marriage campaigns. I'm also happy to say he lives in my legislative district, because I'm planning on running in a couple of years. So, but before settling on Larry and Jerry, we tried everybody and their cousin that we thought was for surely going to help us, and none of them did. But Jerry, in his efforts to educate himself about gay rights, because all he knew is that it was discrimination, it was wrong. And that was his only position in this whole thing, and so we asked him, he did it. So he went to the infamous Walden's book. I didn't realize the connection until tonight. Anyway, he went to Walden's to try to find something to read so he could educate himself about the movement. And all he could find was The Rights of Gay People by the Civil Liberties Union. And he brought the book up to the counter, and he set it down, and he tried to pay the clerk. And the clerk wouldn't take the money out of his hand. It made him set it down on the counter, I think, because he thought he was going to catch something. It wasn't Stephen, he's there. But he was, interestingly enough, Jerry was, particularly at that time, was a very light-skinned African-American, and he thinks that they just thought he was gay. They didn't have any clue that he was an African-American at the time. But he was really our first champion. And he was, of course, the first African-American legislator in Maine as well. So the funny thing about early in January, we decided we were going to have these, we needed spokespersons for the campaign, and so we chose Peter Prizer to be the gay spokesperson, and I would be the straight spokesperson. And you've heard already that we had a little problem with that not very long after that, because even before we were in the legislature in January, I had come out a month before that, or a month and a half, with a woman from away, and nobody knew but me in the state that I was a lesbian, but I had figured it out really quickly. And I can remember, and I know Susan Henderson is here, and I can remember standing around in Susan Henderson's house with Peter and Stan and a bunch of other people, and I said to Peter, "You got to come talk to me." So we went to another room, and I said, "Peter, I have to tell you," and I came out to Peter, and we decided that the only sensible thing we could do was for me to stay in the closet. So I did for the entire first campaign. I was the straight spokesperson for the campaign, which probably was good because I wasn't divorced yet either. And when I did get divorced, it was a little messy, so just as well. You should never marry a reporter if you're going to come out. The other thing I want to talk just briefly about is the hearing that was held in the State House for that first bill. We were really delusional about a lot of things, and we were getting signatures of support around the state. We were going to have the whole state involved. And after we did that, we ended up with like 720 names, which does not seem like the entire state of Maine has risen up in support of gay rights. So we said, well, how are we going to make that look better? Because, you don't want to lie. We had somewhere, I don't know, under 5,000 names, like 700. But so one of us, and I don't know who it was, did an outline map of the state of Maine, and what we did was we wrote the names of every place where we had a signature from, as if there was, this whole statewide thing. Well, unfortunately, there was this big section of the state where there were no names. So we decided that we were, I really should have called my partner's family too, because they were up in Bingham. We might have needed some help up there. But anyway, but I didn't know her then. Anyway, so what we did was we called and called everybody we knew to try to find somebody from Limestone or somewhere that would say that they had signed this. So anyway, we were somewhat honest about this whole thing. Anyway, so at the hearing, we put when I came up to testify, I came up with the thing and set it right in front of the eyes of the legislators and the committee, so they would have to look at the whole time at all of this statewide support. They had a few other things to say, though, many of them. There was a senator from Elliott named Walter Hitchens, who I never forget the names of people who voted and were nasty. So I just want to tell you that. So if you, I can tell you who voted against the ERA today. So anyway, so Walter Hitchens voted against. We didn't expect anything different. He was a Bible-toting conservative, but there was another young Republican legislator from somewhere upstate who really did a whole rap on us about our morality, and he, I believe, was gay. At least that was Peter's assessment. At the time. Right, he was the gay representative, so I had to trust his, his assessment of this. So the interesting thing was that there was no opposition testimony at all. We did this amazing hearing and no one was opposed. So Jerry Talbot, always enthusiastic, he does a whole interview with the press and he says, "We won! We won!" Anyway, but so after they had a little recess, they went searching for, and who should they find but Jasper Wyman, to come quickly testify in opposition, so that it would be clear that there was somebody in opposition to it, because he had heard on the grapevine that there had been nobody testify against the bill, and he asked permission to have special dispensation to get his assertion that the bill would destroy our Judeo-Christian heritage into the record. So 4 days later, of the 13 committee members, 6 of them favored the bill, which actually was the high for several legislatures. But only 6 of them supported the bill, and so it came out ought not to pass. And the bill ultimately went down in the House by a pretty wide margin. It then went in June into the Senate, and the same fate awaited it. But the interesting thing to me was, in anticipation of the vote in the House, the Speaker of the House, who at that time was John Martin, Evil Lake, another irony strikes us, what he did was he cleared out the gallery of the school kids who were there seeing the legislature in session, because he didn't want them to, I guess, hear this debate. And frankly, I have or I guess the archives probably have it now, I had the horse blanket, they used to call it, which is the record of the debate, and it was quite something. And the prime movers were the 2 legislators from Westbrook, a guy named Stanley Laffin, who did a whole rap about sheep. I can't remember what he was to say about it, and the other rep from Westbrook named Bob Carrier, who also was a little more subdued, but not much. And the irony to me was, I had been his daughter's swimming teacher, and I was like, I hope he doesn't find, maybe he should find this out, I don't know. But years later, I had a hysterectomy, and I was coming up from the anesthesia, and I'm looking up at this nurse, and name tag, Michelle Carrier. And I'm like, oh my God, this is my worst nightmare. This is Bob Carrier's daughter is about to deal with me, and I'm under anesthesia, And, but she was fine, and, but it was a little scary. So basically, we went down in flames that first year, but we did it, And I think it was the first campaign in almost every legislature subsequent, except for a couple that were skipped later on in the campaigns, that we chose to stick our neck out and do this. And for me, it led to my great privilege of being one of the founders of the Human Rights Campaign Fund, which I was asked to do by my old friend Steve Van Deen in Washington, and my ex, Kate McQueen, who was active with us on that first campaign, she was the head of the Gay Rights National Lobby at the time, and the 2 of us were involved in the beginning of the Human Rights Campaign Fund, of which I'm very proud to have done. So anyway, I'll stop because it's about time for the me to shut up. The trouble with a group like this is you really want a whole day, and we'll just tell stories. It'll be fun.
I think we had scheduled some time, which, as inevitably happens, we have wildly run into for questions, comments, gestures of appreciation, other songs, reminiscences from people who knew us or didn't know us. Anything out there? Yes. Yes.
Hi, everyone. My name is Carla, and I am part of Pride Portland. And earlier this evening, someone asked me, "Wow, where are you getting your energy?" And what occurred to me is, I'm getting my energy. I'm getting my energy. Get my energy going. What occurred to me is I'm getting my energy from how much this group and this cause has expanded my life. Because I always called myself a reluctant activist. I worked a lot, so the way I could be an activist was donate money. However, I'm retired now and I have plenty of time, so I didn't have that excuse anymore. And I just want to say to the group, and I'm sure the audience will agree, you have all expanded my life in so many rich ways, and I want to thank you so much for this evening. One more thing. I think energy comes from gratitude, and I'm so grateful to be a part of this. And I just want to reach out to the people who are here tonight. We need volunteers. We still need volunteers. We've got a huge march happening on Saturday. We've got a 900-foot pride flag to carry. Please come and carry the flag. So thank you all.
Anything else? Any more questions? It's hard to have any comments after that. Anybody else? Is there in the back?
I'm just going to echo Carla's sentiments, but I have a really random question. What is the significance of the flying purple rhinoceros?
Yes! Who remembers why Tim chose the flying pink rhinoceros?
It originated in Boston, the gay community in Boston. I don't know if there's anyone here that would remember that they used the lavender rhino. One of the slides that you saw of the lavender rhino in the sky was this great big, like it was a float in a gay pride parade in Boston. They actually were able to get to use the lavender rhino in an ad campaign that was done in the subways in Boston. And they chose the rhino because it's basically very gentle until you piss it off. And that's why they chose it. So Tim Bouffard just made ours fly.
I have a question. Hi. There's a lot of people in this room that work on political campaigns. I work on political campaigns. If you haven't, there's a really high burnout rate. So I'm asking, when you're lobbying legislators and you're saying, oh, it didn't work, and that didn't work, and this didn't work, at what point were you like, this is part part of the movement for a greater thing, or were there moments when you went home and thought, are we doing this for nothing? And if so, how did you combat that? And I know there's a lot of you, so I don't know if you can all answer, but go for it.
Well, probably they're all pointing at me as if I have the answer, but the reality is, I worked on the Equal Rights Amendment for a million years. I've worked on reproductive rights for 30, 40 years too. You can't get discouraged ever, but you can take a rest periodically. I, on the other hand, have taken very few rests myself because it's anger and activism that energizes me. So consequently, when I get tired, I'm more likely to do stuff that some other people might not like. So I think it's important to just keep moving. And for some people, they need a rest. And for other people, they need more to do. So it's really hard to say. It's a really individual thing. But, as I said, when Jerry started, or when we started this campaign, we thought it would take 10 years to get gay rights in Maine. Well, it took a tad longer, you might have noticed. So, but you began to change. I think the critical thing that happened in Maine was the whole coming out process. And one of the great, wonderful things in my life, I don't know whether you any of you know of Michael Callan, who was a wonderful songwriter, singer in the movement. And he and I were at a conclave of some sort when we thought up National Coming Out Day. And that was such a critical piece of the movement, is the whole push for people to come out and to be real people to their parents, their siblings, their cousins, their students, their whatever. I think it's coming out that has made a change that enabled what happened in the equality campaigns here in the last few years to happen because people are speaking to others one-to-one with their heart about what it is that would make them whole. And because I personally don't believe that people are mean-spirited to start with. Somebody helps to make them that way. Part of my job is to unmake them that way. But, I've also worked for 35 years in the battered women's movement, so, I got to be on this because, otherwise, how would I have done that? So you have to keep going, and you have to watch the progress. I say sometimes to my young staff who get discouraged in that work, I say, you should have been here in 1979. Honest to God, it was awful. Nobody ever got arrested. Nobody ever cared that women were getting beat up. It just, kept going and going, and it's better now. It really is better now. And part of it's publicity, but a lot of it on this front of gay rights is, I don't mean to point at you, Steve, but is the coming out process. I think was critical to the piece of our making change and not giving up. You can't give up, or it goes down the tubes.
There's a price to be paid for burnout. There's a price to be paid for not being involved. The people I see who are depressed, deflated, cynical, burned out on life are people who are not involved in community, who do not feel as if anything that they do makes any difference. And I think the experience of even losing to have tried is really life-affirming. So I see more people burned out by not having ever been active than people burning out from activity. I see a hand in back. Yes?
Could you speak to a very dark time within the community that I've heard anybody talk about, but the first years of HIV that were so difficult for all of us who were involved with gay men and young people dying. And I also felt at that time in the world it kind of set things back. I remember people that were out would go someplace and they'd hand them, a gay man, they would hand them a paper plate and a fork to eat off of so they could throw it away because they were afraid. And I think it was a very difficult time. And this was a time in the community where it was not just about pride or being able to be yourself, but it was fighting for lives. I'm a physician, I took care of a lot of AIDS patients and young men dying that have been abandoned by their families and nobody to bury them and things like that. And it was a dark time, but somehow, although I was in a closet during that period of my life, but somehow people went ahead and helped get funding for research to bring us the miraculous medications we have now. And I would just like to see if anybody wants to talk about that period, the period of the 80s.
Well, I'll start with I don't know, my own experience. I mean, I had an address book. I always say that not only we were the Stonewall generation, but we were the AIDS generation at all. 10 years after fighting to organize, we were fighting for our lives. And I had so many people crossed out. Last year when I did the 40th anniversary event up at Orono about Wilde-Stein, I had to note, and it's in the displays tonight, all these people that came to the symposium, you know, died of AIDS, 1989, 1990, 1992, 1994, over and over again. When I lived in Los Angeles, I did 2 years of work with the Minority AIDS Project in South Central Los Angeles. And I was astounded about most of my clients. I was in the buddy program, were Black or Latino over a period of years. I was both amazed at how short my tenure was with them, and also how, in some cases, I remember James especially was so incredibly religious and sang in the choir, and how they wouldn't allow his funeral to be in their church. And the other thing you used to get a lot was the families not having anything to want to do with them, or lovers being denied access in the hospital. We know all these stories. At least I hope the current generation is very familiar with those stories. But it was maybe other people have other experiences they want to talk about during that. But boy, those I'm glad those 15 years were really horrible.
Yeah, they really were. I mean, that was part of what the activity I was doing with HRC, but I was arrested in front of the White House in an AIDS protest in, I think, '85. So I have the dubious honor of being the first woman in the United States arrested by police using yellow Playtex living gloves to search down into my trousers to see whether I had a gun, I guess. But it was like surreal in a way, you know, and the police didn't know what to do anyway with us. I mean, they took us all to the jail and they put all the women in one cell and all the men in the other. How stupid was that? Anyway, so it's like, but it was a very hard time, very hard time. You never made it through. I lived in Washington for a few years in that period, and you never made it through a month without 2 or 3 of your friends dying. It was just awful, and you didn't know what to do except to try to get the government to put money into research. And I was involved with Randy Close, who bankrolled the first a huge lobbying campaign in Congress that ultimately resulted in some beginning funding. He later died. I mean, I have a picture of him in my stuff at home of him sitting on the edge of the Grand Canyon for his funeral piece. It was just horrible time. But I think that those of us that were in the trenches on that issue, whether it was doing services or trying to get money into the pipeline, just kept going. And I think that in Maine, we're gay men and lesbians. You've heard how close the communities were. That's been true in Maine, in my experience, all of my activist life. I mean, are we always at the same parties? No, we're not. Do we go to the same places? Not always. But we have cared about each other as a community, men and women, in a way that has not been typical around the country. And I think that during the AIDS epidemic, one of the things that happened is that gay men began to, out of necessity, to look at their lesbian friends, who were the ones that stepped up and took care of many of these men who were ill. And I think it brought the community as a whole closer together than it was before in other places in the country, and here I'm sure as well.
They brought up a lot of real estate. That's meant to be funny.
Well, I think,
I'm sorry, but my comment was in places in the United States where all of these gay men that owned real estate, like on Fire Island and some of the areas in the country, when they could no longer afford those homes because they were being devastated financially, there are numerous, you may not realize it, but many, many lesbians bought those homes in order to keep them within the community. So, whether you know that.
I also think that the AIDS epidemic, horrifying. I'm not trying to make lemonade out of lemon here, but I think back to being in the streets of New York, remembering who first rioted, who first rebelled, who first was out there, were not the people who had much to lose. And there's levels of privilege in any group. All those people we saw hanging out in the apartment houses, cheering us on, who didn't want to be in the streets, and I bear no judgment against them. People who had a lot to lose are usually the last people who want to take part in a revolution. There were some folks quite comfortably in the closet. When we went, Roland was a wonderful, wonderful place. He provided for folks to be out in. When we went to dance for the first time at Valerie's, where the clientele were gay people, gay men in a gunput, and they were horrified that we were dancing in their club. They were horrified that we were actually physically demonstrating the things that they were, but they were in private. And I think the AIDS horror forced many men to have to come out. There was nothing left to lose any longer because their very lives were threatened. And I think it radicalized a lot of people who before had been a little insulated and able to stay in the closet or not participate in a movement, so to speak.
One thing quickly, I just wanted to thank you all that archiving this material is very, very important, and all Maine institutions should do it, and I think it's being done, and I think everybody should write down their experiences, and it's just so important. It's just vital. So, thank you.
Yours too. As part of this panel, to thank you all, because I know there are people out here who might be here now, and I know there are people out here who will be here at these tables 30 or 40 years from now. You know, it takes all of us to make this work. However, wherever we are, we get to go forth and be rhinoceroses.